Good day, everyone. We are the Group C, and our assigned topic that we are going to discuss today was all about the just in time. Upon completion of this chapter, you should be able to understand the GIT philosophy, know and understand the five key elements involved in the operation of GIT system, differentiate the GIT system from the traditional costing system. So, what is just in time? The GIT manufacturing philosophy originated in Japan, primarily by Toyota and Kawasaki, and is being increasingly utilized by American manufacturing companies. GIT means that raw materials are received just in time to go into production. Manufactured parts are completed just in time to be assembled into products, and products are completed just in time to be shipped to customers. GIT required raw materials to be delivered at exactly the points they needed, and just when they are needed to initiate production. Partially processed goods move through the factory in such a way that goods come out of one operation just in time to be processed in the next operation. GIT also transfers finished goods directly for delivery to customers rather than to storage. This arrangement reduces the need for warehouse space and reduces the cost of handling. Inventory production is normally on demand. This type of production is consistent with the production process used by companies which wait for receipt of orders before beginning production, such as custom furniture manufacturers, custom shipbuilders, and custom home builders. Sa madaling sabi, lahat ng mga pampatanggal sa process ay dapat tanggalin. Kasama dito yung paghihintay na dumating yung biniling materials, yung paglilipat ng mga units sa kasunod na process gamit ang ibang equipment, yung paghahanda ng mga equipment na gagamitin. Ang gusto ng GIT, may supplier ka na pwedeng mag-deliver agad pag kailangan mo na yung mga materials sa production. Tapos, yung production area nyo ay magkakatabi na yung mga equipment ayon na rin sa pagkakasunod-sunod sa manufacturing process. Yung hindi na maglilipat sa kabilang ibayo ng factory. Dapat tabi-tabi na sila. Tapos yung equipment, mas ideal na fix rin sa location. Hindi yung magpapalit-palit pa ng pwesto. Kaya kailangang efficient yung layout ng factory. There are five key elements of involved in the operation of a GIT system. The first one is a company must learn to rely on a few suppliers who are willing to make frequent, even daily deliveries in small lots. The second one is a company must improve its product flow lines by creating an individual flow line for each separate products. The third one is a company must reduce the setup time between production run. One way to do this is through employee training. Another way is through automation by creating a flexible manufacturing system or FMS. An FMS is just one part of the overall concept of computer integrated manufacturing, in which a company's business functions are integrated with its manufacturing functions. The fourth one is a company must develop a system of total quality control, or which we call TQC, over its parts and materials. In the absence of TQC, it would be impossible to successfully implement a GIT system. TQC starts with suppliers, who must inspect goods before they are shipped to ensure that the goods are free of defects. The company's own employees are responsible to inspect their own work before sending partially completed units on the next workstation. The last one is A company must develop a flexible workforce. Since the plant layout in GIT environment is different from that of a conventional factory, workers must be multi-skilled in addition to being able to operate all of the machines in a manufacturing cell. Workers must be able to perform routine maintenance on these machines.
Just-in-time is an item inventory management system that aims to make production super efficient. Under this, the raw materials and labor are planned to arrive as and when they are needed in the production. The primary benefit of using JIT is that the company does not have to invest time and money to store the raw materials. But one of the major disadvantages of this inventory management system is that it could lead to potential supply chain disruption. For instance, if one of the supplier fails to deliver the raw materials as per the schedule, it would impact the complete production line. This will install the production, resulting in late delivery or even order cancellation. Under JIT costing, production costs are accumulated with inventory at later stages of the production process. Since work in process and finished goods inventory maintained by the organization are assumed to be minimal, labor and overhead are directly accumulated in cost of goods sold account. At the end of the period, labor and overhead costs for unsold or uncompleted items are backed out and included in the finished good or work in process account. For this reason, JIT costing is referred to as backflush costing. Backflushing, also known as backflush costing or backflush accounting. It is shortened version of the traditional method of accounting for costs. Backflush costing eliminates some of the accounting steps under the traditional costing, and some of the general ledger accounts are combined into one. Under backflush costing, some or all elements of the cost of output are determined only after the production is completed. From a financial accounting perspective, backflushing is the technique of the perpetual inventory system. Small businesses which have a rather modest variety of items in their inventory still use periodic inventory management. A periodic inventory system does not require day-to-day tracking of physical inventory. Traditional costing versus JIT costing. Instead of using separate accounts for material and work in process, as in traditional costing, JIT costing combines them into a raw and in a process account. Traditional costing versus JIT costing. Instead of using separate accounts for materials and work in process, as in traditional costing, JIT costing combines into a raw and in process account. No separate account for direct labor is created. Direct labor and factory overhead are usually charged to a conversion cost account or sometimes direct to a cost of goods sold account. In traditional costing, overhead is applied to products as they are being produced and it's recorded into the work in process account. In JIT costing, overhead is not applied to production until they are completed.
So next, we have the traditional manufacturing cost flow, which is the direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. It is the work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. So the GIT accounting cost flow, the work in process, the finished goods, and the cost of goods sold. So the work in process, it is the labor and overhead costs relating to uncompleted units. And the finished goods, it is the labor and overhead cost relating to unsold units. So the cost of goods sold, it is the labor and overhead cost relating to uncompleted units and labor and overhead cost relating to unsold units. To compare GIT with traditional costing, assume that Trump's company manufactures cellular telephones and uses a GIT production system. So the following transactions occurred during January. So A, Trumps purchased 170,000 pesos of raw materials. B, all materials purchased were requisitioned for production. C, Trumps incurred direct labor cost of 80,000 pesos. And D, actual factory overhead cost amounted to 122,000 pesos. And E, Trumps applied conversion costs total of 202,000 pesos, including direct labor cost of 80,000 pesos. And F, all telephones were completed and sold. The transaction would be recorded in a traditional costing system as follows. So A, debit materials 170,000, credit accounts payable 170,000. B, debit work in process 170,000 and credit materials 170,000. C, debit work in process 80,000, credit across payroll 80,000. And D, debit factory overhead 122,000, credit miscellaneous accounts 122,000. E, debit work in process 122,000, credit factory overhead 122,000. And F, debit finished goods 372,000 and credit work in process 372,000 and debit cost of goods sold 372,000 and credit finished goods 372,000.
So before I will proceed to our T accounts, let me review first our transaction. So remember that we are using the traditional costing and recording these transactions, and later on, after this recording, we will going to record the same transaction using the JIT, or the just-in-time costing system. So the first transaction is Trumps purchased 170,000 of raw materials. So, ang Trumps daw po ay nag-purchase ng 170,000 na raw materials. So, we will going to debit materials of 170,000 and we will going to credit accounts payable of 170,000. So, in letter B, all materials purchased were requisitioned for production. So, yung materials daw po na pinurchase or binili ng Trumps ay ginamit na po daw for production or sa paggawa ng produkto or ng products ng Trumps. So, we will going to debit work in process since ginamit na po yung materials sa pagtrabaho po ng production ng Trumps. And we will going to credit materials of 170,000 since the materials na pinurchase last the previous transaction ay ginamit na po ng Trumps sa production ng product. So letter C, Trumps incurred direct labor costs of 80,000. So dito, bale yung mga workers daw ng Trumps ay nagtatrabaho pero hindi pa nababayaran sa kanilang sweldo or hindi pa po nasusweldohan or hindi pa nila na-receive yung kanilang sahod. So basically, Trumps still has a liability, either it is for the wages, for the salaries, for the bonuses or the benefits that is payable to the employees or the workers of the Trumps. So we will going to debit work in process of 80,000 and credit accrued payroll of 80,000 since may utang pa po yung Trumps sa workers in their salaries. Next, letter D, actual factory overhead costs amounted to 122,000. So here we will go into debit factory overhead of 122,000 and credit miscellaneous accounts of 122,000. Next transaction is letter E, Trumps applied conversion costs total 202,000 including direct labor costs of 80,000. So when we say conversion cost, it is the direct labor and manufacturing overhead involved in the production process. So, here in letter E, here in this transaction, ang trams daw po ay nag-apply na ng conversion cost amounting to 200,000, including, or kasali na po dito yung direct labor sa previous transaction or sa letter C na transaction. Ito po yung utang ng trams sa kanilang workers o sa kanilang employees. Ito po yung salaries ng employees na hindi pa po nababayaran ng trams. So, 80,000 po kasali na dito sa transaction E. So, we will going to debit work in process 122,000 and factory overhead of 122,000. So, we are down now here in our last transaction. Letter F. All telephones were completed and sold. So, it means natapos na daw po yung production at natapos na ang paggawa ng telephones at naibenta na din po lahat ng telephones na natapos in the previous transactions. So, we will going to make 2 transactions here since we have completed and sold. So, the first one yung sa pagkumpleto ng telephones. So, we will going to debit finished goods of 372,000 since natapos na nga po yung paggawa ng telepono natin at nakumpleto na nga po yung mga products po na ibebenta. And then, i-credit natin yung work in process of 372,000 kasi wala na pong trabaho at wala na pong tatrabahuin yung mga employees kasi natapos na yung paggawa ng telephones. So, yung sa pagbenta naman po ng telephones, we will going to debit cost of goods sold kasi naibenta na lahat ng telephones at may napasok na po na mga pera galing sa pagbenta ng telephones. So, we will going to debit cost of goods sold amounting to 372,000 and we will going to credit finished goods of 372,000 kasi nga po natapos na or naibenta na po lahat ng mga telephones at wala na po natira sa trams kasi naibenta na lahat at may napasok na pera galing sa pagbibenta ng products. So, the T accounts of our transactions using the traditional costing system will be look like this. So, we have the materials, work in process, finished goods, factory overhead, accrued payroll, and cost of goods sold. So, in our materials, nag-debit po tayo ng 170,000 kasi ito po yung pinakauna na transaction or sa transaction A na bumili po or na-purchase po yung trams ng materials amounting to 170,000 for the production. And then, nag-credit din po tayo ng 170,000 of materials. Ito po yung sa next transaction or sa transaction B. So, in our work in process, nag-debit po tayo ng 170,000 kasi dito po yung nagsimula na magtrabaho yung mga employees ng trams sa paggawa ng telephones. At dito din po ginamit yung mga materials na pinurchase in the previous transaction. Kaya nga din po tayo nag-credit ng 170,000 na materials kasi ginamit na po yun sa pag-produce or sa trabaho. And then we also have transaction C and transaction E. Work in process, 80,000 and 122,000 of work in process. Kaya nadagdagan po yung debit side natin ng work in process. And then, we also credited 2,000 kasi ito po yung sa last na natapos na or nakompleto na yung production. And kaya wala na pong tatrabahuin yung mga employees. Kaya nag-credit tayo ng work in process na 2,000. And then, sa ating finished goods, nag-debit tayo ng 372,000 kasi ito din po yung sa last na nakompleto na yung products or yung telephones. And then, at the same time, we credited 372,000 kasi ito yung naibenta na lahat ng mga finished telephones or yung finished na goods natin ng trams. And then, next is the factory overhead with debited 122,000 in a transaction D and we credited 122,000 sa transaction E. And then sa accrued payroll, we only have 80,000 sa ating credit side kasi ito yung mga sahod or mga salaries or mga bonuses ng mga employees na hindi pa nababayaran ng trams. May utang pa po yung trams sa mga employees kaya nag-credit po tayo ng accrued payroll of 80,000, amounting to 80,000. And then sa last transaction, we have cost of goods sold. We debited 372,000 kasi ito po yung naibenta na lahat ng telephones at may napasok na ng mga pera sa trams galing sa pagbebenta ng telephones. Okay, so that's how we record the transactions using the traditional costing system. But our topic is all about the JIT costing. So let us try to record the same transactions using the just-in-time costing system. And let us differentiate and let us see the difference between the two. So under JIT costing, no entries are made for transactions B, C, and E. So hindi na daw po kailangan ng entries or wala na po daw entries yung transactions B, C, and E natin, which is meron sa ating traditional costing system. So, entry B is not necessary because the placement of materials into production is implied in transaction A when the materials are first received. So, kaya daw po wala ng entry yung ating transaction B kasi or pinahiwatig or sinabi na siya sa previous na transaction or sa ating transaction A. So, as you can see, meron po tayong materials sa ating transaction A, which is ito yung pinurchase na materials ng trams at ito yung first na materials na na-receive nila. So there is no need or it is not necessary anymore to have an entry for transaction B under the GIT costing kasi meron ng materials sa ating transaction A. Next, no separate entry is made for C because direct labor is combined with factory overhead and may be debited first to conversion cost or may be debited direct to cost of goods sold. So, bakit daw po walang entry yung transaction C natin? Kasi kagaya ng sinabi ko kanina, conversion costs are direct labor and manufacturing overhead. So, it means, bali, iisa na lang yung dalawa or bali combination na lang yung dalawa or gina-combine yung dalawa. Or maybe kaya po walang entry yung transaction C natin kasi baka na-debit na siya, nauna na siyang ma-debit sa ating conversion cost. Or maybe then, na-debit na siya directly sa ating cost of goods sold. Sa ating transaction E naman, pareha lang siya sa ating transaction B. Kaya po walang entry yung transaction E natin kasi meron na pong factory overhead yung sinundan niya na transaction, which is yung transaction D. Nag-debit po tayo ng factory overhead sa ating transaction D, kaya po walang entry or there is no entry needed in our transaction E under JIT costing. So, since wala na po tayong transactions B, C, and E, ang natira na lang po sa atin ay ang transactions A, C, D, and F. Sa transaction A, we debited raw and in process of 170,000 and we credit accounts payable of 170,000. In our transaction C, we debit conversion cost of 80,000 and we credit accrued payroll of 80,000. Next is we credit conversion cost of 122,000 and we credit miscellaneous accounts of 122,000. And in our last transaction, we debit cost of goods sold of 372,000 and we credit raw and in process 170,000 and conversion cost of 202,000. So, the T accounts of our transactions under GIT costing will now look like this. So, we have raw and in process. We debit 170,000 from transaction A and we credit 170,000 from transaction F. While in our conversion cost, we debit 202,000 from transaction D, and we credit 202,000 from transaction F. And in our cost of goods sold, we debit 372,000 from transaction F. And in our wages payable, we credit 80,000 from our transaction C. So actually, there is no big difference between the traditional costing system and the just-in-time costing system. The only difference here in our transaction is that there is no entries for transaction B, C, and E under GIT costing because of the reasons I have said earlier.
Illustrative problem. Assume that Wilkins Company uses GIT costing for the production of goods during the month of January. The following transactions summarize the major steps in Wilkins production during the month of January. Number 1. Raw materials received from suppliers amounted to 4,000. Number 2. Direct labor cost of 10,400 and overhead cost of 7,800 were incurred and applied, respectively, during the month of January. Number 3. The cost of work in process at January 31 was 3,600. This cost was determined through the production report and is composed of the following elements. Direct materials 1,500, direct labor 1,200, and overhead 900. In addition, assume that finished goods inventory at January 31 was 6,500, consisting of direct materials 1,500, direct labor 2,850, and overhead 2,150. The journal entries under GIT costing or the just-in-time costing are the following. So for number 1, raw materials received from suppliers amounted to 4,000. So the debit here is raw and in process 4,000 and credit accounts payable 4,000. So the explanation for this is to record product cost. And for number 2, direct labor cost 10,400 and overhead cost of 7,800 were incurred and applied respectively during the month of January. So the debit here is cost of goods sold amounted to 18,200 and the credit here is wages payable 10,400 and factory overhead control 7,800. So to get the total of cost of goods sold, we need to add the two credits which are the wages payable and the factory overhead control. The materials received amounted to 4,000 and we need to less or subtract it in materials in raw and in process, which is 1,500. And the amount to be backflush is 2,500. And our journal entry for this is debit finished goods 2,500 and credit raw and in process 2,500. And the explanation for this is to record transfer of cost of units completed. And for number 4, the materials cost of units completed is 2,500 and we need to less or subtract it to materials in finished goods end, which is 1,500. And the amount to be backflush is 1,000. And our journal entry for this is cost of goods sold debit 1,000 and credit finished goods 1,000. And our explanation is to record transfer of units sold. And for number 5, the raw and in process, the labor cost for raw and in process amounted to 1,200 and the overhead for raw and in process amounted to 900. So the total to be adjusted is 2,100. And for the finished goods, the labor cost for finished goods is amounted to 2,850 and the overhead for finished goods amounted to 2,150. And the total to be adjusted is 5,000. And our journal entries for this are the debit raw and in process amounted to 2,100 and debit finished goods 5,000 and credit cost of goods sold 7,100. So we get the 7,100 by adding the raw and in process, which is 2,100, and the finished goods, which is 5,000.